The day I checked my savings account, I realized my parents had been hiding something from me. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a banking error. The balance on my Chase mobile app read exactly $412. Just 24 hours earlier, that number was $42,000. That was my entire life savings, earned from 3 years of pulling double shifts as a nurse at Boston Medical Center, living on instant coffee and sheer willpower. I had been skipping vacations, driving a beaten-up Honda Civic, and packing my own lunches, all so I could finally put a down payment on a small condo in Quincy. My chest went completely tight. I couldn't breathe. My fingers were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone onto the cold tile of my kitchen floor. I stared at the transaction history. There was a single, massive transfer initiated the night before. The destination account belonged to my parents, Richard and Ellen. I sat down on the edge of my couch, trying to rationalize it. My parents aren't thieves. They raised me in a comfortable, middle-class home in Massachusetts. My dad worked in insurance for 30 years, and my mom was a school administrator. They taught me the value of $1. But as I stared at that screen, a sick feeling started to coil in my stomach. I remembered that my dad's name was still attached to that account as a joint owner. He had helped me open it when I was 18, right before I left for college, so he could help me transfer money for textbooks. Over the years, I completely forgot his name was even on the paperwork. I called my mom first. It rang 4 times before she picked up, her voice sounding unusually bright. She asked me how my shift went. She asked if I was coming over for Sunday dinner. I didn't answer her questions. I just asked her why my money was gone. The line went completely dead for a few seconds. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. When she finally spoke, the cheerful tone was entirely gone, replaced by a defensive, strained nervousness that made my heart drop even further. She told me we needed to talk about it in person. She said it was a family emergency. I drove over to their house in Braintree, breaking the speed limit the entire way. My mind was racing with terrifying scenarios. Was someone sick? Was the house in foreclosure? Did my dad lose his job? I was ready to give them the money if they truly needed it. I loved them. They were my parents. But the fact that they took it without asking made me feel like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. When I walked through the front door, my parents were sitting at the dining room table. But they weren't alone. Sitting between them was my younger brother, Leo. Leo was 24, a charming, reckless guy who had bounced from one failed business venture to another, always expecting everyone else to clean up his messes. My parents had always catered to him, shielding him from every consequence because he was the baby of the family. My dad looked up at me, his eyes tired and filled with a mixture of guilt and stubborn pride. He pointed to an official-looking document resting on the table. That's when I realized this wasn't an emergency at all. My dad cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes as he tapped his fingers on the paperwork. He told me that Leo had an incredible opportunity. It was a franchise investment for a boutique fitness center in South Boston, a guaranteed moneymaker, but the deadline to secure the territory was that afternoon. Leo needed $50,000 down. He only had $8,000. I stood there in the dining room, looking from my father's guilty face to my mother's pleading expression, and finally to Leo, who was staring at his phone like we were discussing the weather. I felt a wave of absolute disbelief wash over me. I asked my dad how he could just reach into my account and take my entire future for a gamble on Leo's latest whim. My mom jumped in immediately, her voice hushed and frantic. She said they weren't stealing it. She said it was just a temporary loan, and Leo was going to pay me back with interest the second the business launched. I looked at Leo and asked him if he knew where that money came from. I asked him if he knew about the 70-hour work weeks, the holiday shifts I took so other nurses could see their kids, and the nights I cried from sheer exhaustion in the hospital break room. Leo rolled his eyes, sighing loudly. He muttered that I was being dramatic and that family is supposed to support each other. That hit me hard. I turned to my dad, the man who had always taught me about financial responsibility, and asked how he could do this to me. My dad finally looked up, his jaw set in a hard, defensive line. He said he was the head of this family and he had to look at the bigger picture. He told me that I was doing well, that I had a steady career, and that I could always save the money back up. But Leo needed a break. Leo needed his family to believe in him. At that point I realized everything had changed. The people who were supposed to protect me were treating my hard work like a communal family fund. If you've ever faced financial conflict within your family, let me know in the comments. I told them I wanted the money back in my account by Monday morning, or I was going to the bank to report an unauthorized withdrawal. My mom flinched, looking terrified. But my dad just leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. He told me to go ahead and try. He reminded me that his name was legally on that account. As far as Citizens Bank was concerned, it was his money just as much as it was mine. I felt all the blood rush to my ears. He was right. Legally, I had no leg to stand on, and he knew it. I looked at the three of them sitting at that table, looking like a united front against me. I realized that my obedience and my quiet, reliable nature had made them think I would just swallow this betrayal to keep the peace. I didn't say another word. I turned around, walked out of the house, and got back into my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the key in the ignition. I drove back to my apartment in complete silence, the reality of my situation sinking in. I was completely broke, my family had exploited my trust, and my dream of buying a home was shattered. But as the initial shock faded, a cold, sharp anger took its place. I wasn't going to let them ruin my life. I spent the entire night staring at my laptop, reviewing every financial document, tax form, and account statement I had accumulated over the past 5 years. If they wanted to play by strict legal rules, I was going to look at everything. Around 3 in the morning, I found something buried in an old folder from when I was a student. I wish I had stopped asking questions. The old folder contained the tax documents from my college years, back when I was working part-time at a local clinic and taking out student loans. Because I was young, my dad had handled the paperwork. As I scrolled through the digital copies of our joint filings from 5 years ago, something didn't add up. There was a substantial educational tax credit and a state grant listed under my Social Security number for my junior year. It totaled $11,000. I remembered that year vividly. That was the winter my dad told me the bank had denied our supplemental student loan application. He had told me that if I didn't find a way to pay the remaining tuition by January, I would have to drop out. I ended up taking a grueling night shift at a nursing home, sleeping 3 hours a day just to cover the balance. But according to these official IRS documents, the money had been approved and disbursed. It just never went to the university. It had been deposited into my dad's personal checking account. I sat back in my desk chair, the room spinning. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment because they were desperate to help Leo. This was a pattern. My dad had been using my name and my financial identity to bail himself out for years, and I had been too trusting to ever check the math. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By 8 a.m., I was waiting outside the Citizens Bank branch down the street from my apartment. When the doors opened, I walked straight to a customer service desk. I showed the manager my ID and asked to see the complete history of the joint savings account, stretching back to its creation. The manager printed out a thick stack of paper, her expression growing increasingly sympathetic as she watched me scan the pages. The $42,000 wasn't the first major withdrawal. Over the last 2 years, there were dozens of smaller transfers. $500 here. $1,000 there. Every time I had celebrated reaching a new savings milestone, my dad had been quietly skimming off the top, taking just enough that I wouldn't notice unless I checked the exact balance down to the penny. I looked at the dates of the largest transfers. They perfectly lined up with Leo's credit card deadlines and the down payment on Leo's new sports car. My phone started buzzing in my hand. It was a text from my mom, asking if I had calmed down yet. She wrote that Leo was at the franchise office right now, signing the lease, and that they were all celebrating at a restaurant in Quincy later. They wanted me to come. They wanted to toast to our family's new future. I stared at the text, feeling a profound sense of detachment. They were celebrating a new beginning built entirely on the bones of my sacrifice. I looked down at the bank statements in my hands, and then back at my phone. I knew exactly what I had to do. I legally couldn't force the bank to give back the $42,000 because my dad's name was on the account. But as I looked closer at the original account opening documents from 8 years ago, I noticed a tiny, handwritten detail that my dad had completely overlooked. But what I discovered in the bank records the next morning changed everything. The handwritten detail was a checkmark next to a small, easily missed box on the signature page. When we had opened the account, the bank clerk had asked if we wanted an either / or signature requirement, or a joint and several restriction for closing or modifying the account itself. My dad, probably not paying attention or assuming I'd never check, had initialed the box that required both account holders to sign off on any fundamental structural changes, including removing a name or closing the account permanently. More importantly, listed right underneath that section was my childhood checking account, which was linked to the savings. That checking account held a line of credit that my dad had co-signed on years ago to help me build my credit score. Because the accounts were legally tied, and because he was a co-signer on that active line of credit, his legal financial liability was deeply intertwined with mine. If that line of credit defaulted, or if there was a massive legal dispute over the tied assets, it wouldn't just affect me. It would automatically trigger an audit on his primary accounts at the same institution. I looked up at the bank manager. I asked her what would happen if I froze the entire linked asset structure due to suspected internal identity fraud, using the old IRS documents and the unapproved skimming transfers as evidence. The manager's face went serious. She told me that if I filed a formal internal dispute, the bank would be legally required to place a hold on all funds associated with his name at Citizens Bank until a full investigation was completed. That meant his personal checking, his joint account with my mom, and the funds he had just transferred to help Leo would be completely locked. I took a deep breath. I told her to initiate the freeze. By the time I walked out of the bank into the bright morning sun, my phone was blowing up. I had 6 missed calls from my dad and 3 frantic texts from my mom. I ignored them all, got into my car, and drove straight to the boutique fitness franchise office in South Boston. I knew exactly where it was because Leo had posted the address on his Instagram story, bragging about his new corporate headquarters. When I walked into the sleek, glass-walled lobby, I saw them. Leo was sitting at a conference table, a pen in his hand, smiling widely as a representative in a sharp suit pointed to the signature line of a thick contract. My dad was standing right behind him, looking like a proud mentor. I opened the glass door and walked right into the room. Leo looked up, his smile faltering. He asked me what the hell I was doing there. My dad stepped forward, his forehead creasing with anger, telling me that this wasn't the time or the place for a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I looked directly at the franchise representative and told him that the $50,000 wire transfer they were expecting from my father's account was currently frozen under a bank fraud investigation. The room went dead silent. The representative stopped smiling and looked down at his tablet. My dad's face turned an angry, violent shade of red. He stepped toward me, his voice trembling as he told me I had gone too far. That's when I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. My dad slammed his hands down on the glass conference table, demanding that I leave immediately. He apologized profusely to the franchise representative, claiming I was just a disgruntled family member going through a personal crisis. But the representative wasn't buying it. He looked at his tablet, looked back up at my dad, and quietly closed the folder containing the contract. He told us that until the funds cleared, no papers could be signed. Leo jumped out of his chair, his face contorted in a mix of panic and pure rage. He screamed at me, asking how I could be so selfish, how I could ruin his one shot at making something of himself. I looked at my little brother, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to protect him. I told him that if his dream was built on stealing my 3 years of sweat and exhaustion, then it wasn't a dream at all. It was a crime. My dad grabbed my arm, trying to pull me out into the hallway, but I shook him off. I told him right there, in front of the stranger, that the bank was already reviewing the $11,000 he stole from my college grants, along with every single microtransfer he made over the last 2 years. The proud, stubborn look on my dad's face completely evaporated. He went pale, his mouth opening slightly as he realized I had actually dug up the past. He whispered that we were family, that we were supposed to handle things in-house. I told him he lost the right to call us a family the moment he used his legal access to rob his own daughter. We walked out of that building in a tense, suffocating silence. On the sidewalk of the busy Boston street, my dad turned to me, his voice finally cracking with genuine desperation. He explained that his insurance adjustments had plummeted over the past year, that they were drowning in credit card debt trying to keep up appearances in Braintree, and that he thought Leo's business was their only way out of the financial hole. He looked small. He looked old. For a second, a wave of familiar guilt hit me. But I forced myself to stand firm. I told him that their financial struggles didn't give them the right to drown me along with them. Just then, my mom pulled up to the curb in her SUV, having driven frantically from the house after receiving my dad's panicked texts. She rolled down the window, tears streaming down her face, begging us all to get in the car so we could go home and talk. I looked at the three of them, my mother weeping, my father broken, and my brother staring at me with pure hatred. I realized that going back to that house meant stepping right back into the trap of their manipulation. I told them I was taking an Uber back to my apartment, and that the only way the bank freeze would be lifted was if we sat down with a legal mediator to draw up a binding repayment contract. My dad stepped forward, his eyes pleading. He asked what would happen to Leo's franchise territory if the money stayed frozen for weeks. I didn't answer. I turned my back on them and walked toward the nearest coffee shop to wait for my ride. But as I sat by the window watching their car pull away, my phone rang. It wasn't my parents or Leo. It was an unknown number from a local law firm. I hesitantly answered it, and what the voice on the other end told me made my stomach drop all over again. The voice on the line introduced herself as an attorney representing my maternal grandmother, Evelyn. My grandmother had passed away 6 months prior, and the entire family had been under the impression that her estate was completely dried up by her assisted living expenses in Cape Cod. My parents had told me there was nothing left but a few boxes of old photographs and vintage china. The attorney told me that wasn't true at all. She explained that before my grandmother passed, she had explicitly set aside a specific asset structure completely separate from her main will. It was a protected educational and housing trust fund, and I was named as the sole beneficiary. The catch was that my dad had been appointed as the executor of that specific trust because I was still in nursing school when the paperwork was originally finalized. The attorney said she was calling because she had received an automated notification from Citizens Bank. The internal fraud freeze I had initiated just an hour ago had automatically locked the trust's underlying administrative account, which my dad had quietly modified just 3 weeks ago. I asked her what my dad had changed. Her tone turned incredibly grave. She told me that my dad had filed an emergency amendment claiming I had suffered a medical incapacitation, attempting to reroute the entire $60,000 trust balance into his personal checking account. He had used a falsified medical document from the clinic where he used to handle the books. I sat in that crowded coffee shop, the noise of the espresso machines fading into a dull hum. My own father hadn't just taken my savings. He had actively stolen an inheritance my grandmother had left to secure my future, and he had legally lied about my health to do it. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was serious fraud. If you enjoy emotional real-life stories, don't forget to subscribe. I thanked the attorney and told her to email me every single piece of documentation she had. Within 10 minutes, my inbox was flooded with PDFs showing my dad's signature on the fraudulent incapacitation forms. My phone started ringing again. It was my mom. I picked it up, my voice completely dead. Before she could start crying or begging again, I told her I knew about Grandma Evelyn's trust. I told her I knew what Dad had done. The line went completely quiet. In the background, I could hear my dad frantically asking her what I was saying. When my mom finally spoke, her voice was trembling so badly she could barely form words. She whispered that they were desperate, that the mortgage on the Braintree house was 3 months behind, and that Leo had promised he would pay everything back tenfold once the gym opened. She begged me not to go to the police. She said it would destroy their family name, and that my dad could face actual prison time. I looked at the documents on my screen. I felt a deep, agonizing pain in my chest, realizing how far my parents had fallen to protect my brother's reckless delusions. They were willing to sacrifice my career, my reputation, and my sanity just to keep up appearances. I told my mom that I wouldn't file a police report on one condition. I wanted a mandatory family meeting that night at my apartment, and they were going to bring their financial advisor and Leo. When they arrived at my apartment at 7 p.m., the atmosphere was thick with tension. Leo looked furious, my mom looked hollow, and my dad looked like a man walking to his own execution. I sat across from them at my small kitchen table, spreading out the bank statements, the IRS forms, and the fraudulent trust amendments. I told them exactly how this was going to go. But what Leo did next made me realize that some people are completely incapable of remorse. Leo stood up from the table, let out a harsh laugh, and grabbed the stack of papers. He literally ripped the fraudulent trust documents right down the middle, throwing the pieces in my face. He yelled that these were just copies, that I had no real leverage, and that I was bluffing because I was too weak to ever actually put my own father in jail. He looked at our parents and told them to stop groveling to me, saying that we should just walk out and let the bank lawyers sort it out. My mom gasped, covering her mouth in shock. My dad didn't move. He just stared at the ripped paper on the floor, his face completely pale. I didn't flinch. I reached over, unlocked my phone, and tapped the screen. A crisp, perfectly clear audio recording began to play. It was the phone call from earlier that afternoon. My mom's voice echoed through the quiet apartment, clearly admitting that my dad had falsified the medical documents, that they were 3 months behind on their mortgage, and that they had taken the money. Leo's smug expression completely evaporated. He sank back into his chair, his mouth hanging open. I looked at my dad. I told him that the digital originals of those trust documents were safely in my attorney's inbox, along with this audio recording. I told him that I had spent my entire life being the good daughter, the reliable one who never made trouble, but that version of me died the second they emptied my bank account. My dad broke down. He put his head in his hands and finally began to weep, loud, heavy sobs of absolute defeat. He admitted everything. He looked at Leo and told him it was over, that there was no franchise, no shortcuts, and no more bailing him out. The financial advisor they brought along, a quiet man who had kept his distance the entire evening, finally spoke up. He looked at the documents and then at my parents. He told them bluntly that if I went to the authorities, the evidence was airtight. He advised my dad that his only option to avoid criminal charges was to sign whatever agreement I put in front of him. We spent the next 3 hours hammering out the terms of a strict, legally binding restructuring agreement. First, my dad had to legally remove his name from every single one of my accounts, giving me sole, uncompromised control. Second, the $60,000 from Grandma Evelyn's trust was to be immediately transferred to a new, locked account at a completely different bank under my name only. As for the $42,000 they had already taken, we drew up a strict promissory note backed by the equity in their Braintree home. They had to pay me back $1,000 a month, with interest. To afford it, my dad would have to sell his new car, and Leo would have to get a real, hourly job to contribute to the household mortgage. If they missed even a single payment, the agreement stated that I would immediately hand the fraud evidence over to the district attorney. When Leo realized he was going to have to actually work to pay off the family debt, he stormed out of my apartment, slamming the door behind him. My parents didn't chase after him this time. They just sat there, signing the papers with trembling hands. When it was finally over, my mom looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. She asked if I could ever forgive them. I looked at the people who had raised me, feeling a complicated mix of deep sadness and profound relief. I told them that I loved them, but that forgiveness was going to take a very long time, and trust might never return. They left my apartment just before midnight. For the first time in days, the suffocating weight in my chest was gone. Looking back now, that painful night was the beginning of my true independence. It took 18 months of strict adherence to the legal agreement, but my parents paid back every single cent of my savings. The constant pressure to bail out my brother forced Leo to finally grow up. He's currently working a retail management job, finally learning the value of $1. My relationship with my parents is still distant, but we are slowly rebuilding it on a foundation of strict boundaries and honest conversations. Last week, I finally closed on that small condo in Quincy. Standing in my own kitchen, looking out at the Boston skyline, I realized that saving myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. If there is one thing this heartbreak taught me, it's that protecting your financial future isn't selfish. Love without honesty cannot survive, and real respect always includes respecting someone's hard-earned money. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real-life emotional stories. Your support means everything to me, and I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments down below. See you in the next story.